There is a particular sound a house makes when strangers are emptying it. Not a crash, not a bang. A steady, patient scraping, the sound of furniture being dragged across floorboards that know your footsteps by heart. I stood on the sidewalk in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and listened to that sound coming out of the front door of the house I had owned for 43 years. One of the movers noticed me watching. He was young, polite, sweating through a gray shirt. He set down the end of a dresser and wiped his forehead. "Sir, are you here to pick something up before we finish?" I looked past him, at the hallway I had painted 4 times, at the door frame where I had penciled a small line every birthday for a boy who was now 41 years old. "No," I said quietly. "I think you're taking everything." He frowned. "I thought the owner already moved out." "I am the owner." Before he could answer, my son stepped through the front door holding a manila envelope. He looked uncomfortable, not guilty, just uncomfortable, the way a man looks when the weather has inconvenienced his plans. "Hi, Dad." That was how it began. Before I go any further, let me say this. If stories about family, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe to my channel. What you're about to hear took 14 years to live, and only a little while to tell, and I'd rather tell it to people who understand why it matters. My name is Gerald Whitfield. I was 68 years old that afternoon, though I felt considerably older by the time the sun went down. No hug, no explanation, no warning. Just 2 words, spoken the way you'd greet a man you'd bumped into at the grocery store, delivered instead in the front yard where I had taught him to throw a baseball, where we had built a treehouse one humid August, where his mother had planted roses every single spring until the cancer took her 12 years before. My eyes drifted toward the moving truck at the curb. Our dining table was already inside, strapped against the wall. Eleanor's china cabinet followed, carried out at an angle through the door she had chosen the paint for. The rocking chair she'd bought me for our 25th anniversary disappeared into the truck's dark mouth. I looked back at my son. "Nathan, what is this?" He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he has rehearsed something and is discovering that rehearsal doesn't help. "We sold the house." I laughed. Not because it was funny. There are moments so impossible that the mind refuses them outright, and the body has to do something with the refusal. "You sold my house. It was the practical thing to do. My name is on the deed. You signed a power of attorney before your surgery." The words landed harder than any punch I had taken in 68 years, and I had taken a few. 6 weeks earlier, I had gone into the hospital for a knee replacement. The recovery had been slower than the doctors promised, and my insurance approved a short stay at a rehabilitation center out past the highway. Nathan handled the paperwork while I focused on the humbling business of learning to walk again at 68. There had been a folder. There had been a pen. There had been a young notary with a cold and a rubber stamp. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. "I signed that so you could pay my bills," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "It gave me authority. It wasn't yours to sell." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The lawyer said the document was broad. General powers. It covered real property. Everything was legal." Legal. Funny how people reach for that word the way a man reaches for a railing, when what they really need is a mirror. A woman I had never seen before came out of my house carrying a clipboard. "Nathan, closing documents are loaded." Closing. So it was already done. There had never been a moment when it could have been stopped. The stopping had happened in a conference room somewhere, while I was learning to climb 4 carpeted stairs, with a physical therapist counting under her breath. I looked toward the front porch. The brass wind chime Eleanor bought at a craft fair outside Cleveland still hung beside the door. The breeze moved through it and it sang, the same 3 notes it had sung for 20 years. Then a mover reached up, unhooked it, and dropped it into a cardboard box. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, the way a beam cracks inside a wall where nobody sees it for years. Renee came outside then, my daughter-in-law, dressed for a long drive in expensive sunglasses and white sneakers so clean, they looked as though they had never touched a sidewalk. "We've got to leave if we're going to make Kentucky before dark." She handed me the envelope Nathan had been holding. "What's this?" "Something to help you get started." I opened it. Inside was one crisp $100 bill. Folded beside it was a torn piece of notebook paper with 4 words in my son's handwriting. The same handwriting I had taught him at a kitchen table with a fat pencil in his fist. "You'll figure it out." I read the words twice, Then a third time. I turned the paper over, and I think some part of me genuinely expected there to be more. An explanation, an address, a joke that would break and let the real conversation begin. There was nothing else. I looked up at my son. You left me $100. You've always been resourceful. Renee crossed her arms. We're giving you independence. I blinked at her. Independence. We didn't think you'd want to spend the rest of your life sitting in some assisted living facility. I never asked to. We figured you'd rather make your own choices. I looked at the two of them standing in front of the house where a woman named Eleanor had once made pancakes on Saturday mornings for a boy in dinosaur pajamas. I didn't know becoming homeless was one of my choices. Neither of them answered. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Finally, Nathan spoke. We're moving to North Carolina. I can see that. There are better schools for Caleb. He starts kindergarten next fall. My grandson was 4 years old. I had held him in the hospital the day he was born, and he had gripped my finger with the absolute confidence of someone who assumed the world was arranged in his favor. He deserves opportunities, Nathan said, and I don't. His eyes dropped toward the driveway. We couldn't afford 2 households. I almost said it then. I almost reminded him that he had never in his life made a mortgage payment on that house, that it had been paid off free and clear a decade before, that there was not a single dollar of debt attached to it. Selling it had not rescued anyone from anything. It had simply converted 4 decades of my life into a number in his bank account. Money Eleanor and I had earned by skipping vacations, by driving cars until they died, by sitting at that kitchen table with a calculator on nights when the arithmetic wouldn't cooperate. I didn't say any of it. Instead, I asked the only question that actually mattered at 4 in the afternoon. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight? Nathan hesitated. There are motels. You've got the 100. Renee sighed, a theatrical little sound. Dad, you're tougher than you think. I noticed that she still called me Dad. Funny how that worked. She could claim me as family in the same breath she used to help erase the evidence that I had ever had one. Across the street, my neighbor Mrs. Doyle came slowly down her front walk. She had lived beside us almost as long as we had lived there. Her eyes were red and swollen. She hugged me without saying a word, the fierce bony hug of a woman in her 80s who has decided something is wrong and intends to be counted on the right side of it. Then she turned and looked directly at my son. I hope your children never learn from this. Nathan looked away. Renee muttered something under her breath and walked toward the car. The moving truck pulled away from the curb. Then the second one. Within 20 minutes, 43 years had gone down the street and around the corner. Only tire tracks in the grass remained, and even those would be gone by morning. Nathan walked over carrying my old canvas duffel bag. We packed your clothes and your medications. I took it. It felt surprisingly light. Everything else, every photograph, every tool I had bought with my first paycheck, every letter Eleanor had ever written me during the year I worked out of state, gone into a truck bound for an estate liquidator. I guess that's it, Nathan said. I guess it is. He waited. I think he expected me to shout. I think some part of him wanted me to, because a shouting man is easier to leave than a quiet one. Instead, I reached into the envelope, folded the $100 bill carefully, and slid it into my wallet. I'll keep this. His face softened for the first time all afternoon. I knew you'd understand. I almost smiled. He understood nothing at all. I walked toward my old pickup truck, parked at the curb, nearly 200,000 miles on it, a dent in the tailgate from a fence post in 1998. It started every single morning. Unlike people, machines generally do what they promise. Mrs. Doyle caught up with me, breathing hard. Gerald, please, come stay with us. I squeezed her hand. I appreciate it. You don't have to do this alone. I know, but something inside me needed silence more than it needed a spare bedroom. Not pity, not advice. Not the well-meaning company of good people who would look at me across a dinner table with soft, careful eyes. Just silence and enough road to think in. I drove until sunset. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet truck stop outside Columbus and parked beneath dim lot light that buzzed like a trapped insect. The cab smelled of motor oil and old coffee. I leaned the driver's seat back as far as it would go. My new bedroom. I unfolded the note one last time and held it up to the orange light. You'll figure it out. For the first time all day, I found myself agreeing with my son. I will, I whispered into the darkness. But not the way you think. That night, lying in an aging pickup truck with $100 to my name, I made a promise that would shape every year I had left. I would never ask my son for another penny as long as I lived. And someday, whether he cared or not, whether he ever knew or not, he would understand precisely what he had thrown into the back of a truck and driven away from. The first morning after sleeping in my truck, I woke with a stiff back, a swollen knee, and absolutely no idea what came next. For 43 years I had known exactly where I would wake up. I knew which floorboard in the hallway groaned. I knew how the morning light came through the kitchen window in October and laid a bright rectangle across the table. I knew where Eleanor kept the coffee filters, even though she had been gone for over a decade, and I had moved them twice. Now I was brushing my teeth in a truck stop restroom while 18-wheelers idled outside, and a man in a company jacket held the door for me and called me sir. Life changes quickly, pride changes faster. I sat in the driver's seat for a long while, staring at the $100 bill flattened in my wallet. For one brief moment I considered calling Nathan. Not to beg, just to ask a single question. Why? But I already knew the answer, and no version of it he could offer would change where I had slept. So I folded the money away and drove toward downtown Columbus. Around noon I parked outside the church Eleanor and I had attended whenever we came into the city, the one with the crooked bell tower and the terrible parking lot. I wasn't expecting a miracle. I wanted somewhere quiet to sit and let my mind stop spinning. Pastor Michael Ortiz recognized me before I reached the front steps. Gerald, he looked genuinely shocked. I heard you had surgery. I did. How are you walking already? I don't have much choice. Something in my voice made him stop smiling. Come inside. An hour later, after listening to the entire thing without interrupting once, and I have learned since that this is a rarer gift than most people realize. He leaned back in his chair. I've been counseling families for 30 years, he said. Sometimes strangers treat each other better than relatives do. I nodded. I don't need anyone to fix this. I know. I just need somewhere to stand long enough to figure out my next step. He smiled. Then let's start there. The church owned a small apartment above the old fellowship hall. Normally it housed visiting missionaries or traveling speakers. It happened to be empty. It's not fancy, Michael said. It sounds perfect. He wouldn't take rent. So I made my own arrangement instead. I would fix things. Doors that stuck. Pews that had gone wobbly under 50 years of Sunday mornings. A cabinet in the nursery, with a hinge that had surrendered sometime during the Nixon administration. By the end of my first week, I had repaired nearly everything in that building that squeaked, leaked, or rattled. Working with my hands had always calmed me. Eleanor used to laugh at me about it. She'd stand in the garage doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, watching me clamp a joint. You don't just fix furniture, she'd say. You fix yourself. She was right. She usually was, and she was gracious enough not to point it out more than twice a week. Every screw I tightened quieted another angry thought. Every broken hinge reminded me that damaged things are not automatically worthless. One afternoon, while I was replacing trim in the fellowship hall, an elderly woman came in through the side door, carrying a rocking chair with one broken leg. I heard there's a man here who can fix anything. I smiled. That's a dangerous rumor. She laughed. My husband built this chair 50 years ago. I turned it over and examined the break. Solid white oak. Excellent joinery. The kind a patient man does on weekends. The leg had simply cracked along the grain from age and dry heat. I think I can help. She asked what I charged. I shrugged. How about $20? She looked genuinely offended. That's all? It's about 2 hours of work. She shook her head. No wonder they let you live upstairs. 3 days later, she came back with 2 more pieces. Then her sister called. Then a neighbor. Then a woman from a congregation on the other side of town who had heard about it from somebody's daughter-in-law. Within a month, my tiny apartment looked considerably more like a furniture workshop than a home. Pastor Michael walked in one evening and stood in the doorway staring at the chairs, tables, and cabinets lined against every wall like patients in a waiting room. I think we've outgrown the guest room. I laughed. You might be right. A retired mechanic named Gus Bennett overheard us after Sunday service. He was a wide, sunburned man of about 75 with hands like catcher's mitts. I've got an old repair shop out past the county line, he said. Been sitting empty 3 years. I can't afford commercial rent. Gus waved me off with genuine irritation. Then don't. I won't take charity. It isn't charity. He pointed a thick finger toward a row of broken cabinets against the fellowship hall wall. Fix that place up and you can stay until business gets rolling. Building's been rotting anyway. I'd rather it rot with somebody in it. We shook hands, that's simple. No contracts, no lawyers, no clause about broad general powers over real property. Just two men who still believed a handshake meant something. I spent the next several weeks cleaning, painting, building shelves, rewiring lights that hadn't worked since the 90s. The front bays were empty and cavernous. The back room still had sturdy workbenches under an inch of dust, and underneath everything, the place had good bones. By the time I finished, it looked like somewhere a person might bring something precious. Customers began dropping off antiques from all over central Ohio. Some pieces weren't worth the gas it took to bring them. Others belonged in a museum. I treated every single one exactly the same way, because every object that comes through a door like mine is carrying somebody's memory on its back. You don't restore wood, you restore history. One Saturday afternoon, a young woman arrived carrying an old cedar chest with both arms, walking sideways through the doorway. It belonged to my grandmother. The lid barely opened. Water damage had blackened one side and lifted the veneer along the bottom edge. Can you save it? I ran my fingers across the grain, feeling for the places where the wood had given up, and the places where it hadn't. I think so. She smiled hopefully. Everyone else told me it wasn't worth fixing. I looked at her. Worth fixing and worth replacing aren't the same question. She came back 2 weeks later. The moment she saw the chest, her eyes filled. It looks exactly like I remember. No, I said gently. It looks exactly like your grandmother remembered. She hugged me before she left. Those moments became my paycheck. Not the money, the gratitude. There is a particular expression that comes over a person's face when something they had written off turns out to be recoverable. And after a certain age, you begin to suspect that expression is what the entire world runs on. Word spread faster than I expected. Customers started driving 2 hours, then 3. An antique dealer in Cincinnati called and asked whether I would consider restoring an entire collection. I accepted. Another dealer recommended me to a county historical society. Within a season, I had more work than one man with a rebuilt knee could finish alone. And somewhere in there, something happened that surprised me more than any of it. For the first time since I had lost my house, I went an entire day without thinking about my son. Pain doesn't disappear. It simply loses the argument against purpose. One evening, Pastor Michael stopped by the shop. He stood in the middle of the floor, turning slowly, taking in the half-finished rocking chairs, the dining tables on their backs like patients, the dressers waiting in a row. You've been busy. I looked around with him. I forgot how much I loved doing this. He shook his head. I don't think you forgot. I think life got loud. That stayed with me for years. Life had gotten loud. Mortgage payments, overtime, raising a boy, hospital parking garages, funerals, obligations that arrived faster than they could be met. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, I had stopped building, because I enjoyed it and started building only because someone expected me to. Now, at nearly 70, with $100 still folded in my wallet, I was finally building again for myself. Around Christmas, the local paper ran a small article. Retired carpenter gives family heirlooms a second life. Nothing dramatic. 400 words and a photograph of me squinting into a flash. The reporter had asked what inspired me. I answered honestly. I know what it's like to lose something you thought you'd have forever. Business doubled after that article ran. I hired my first employee that winter, a 24-year-old veteran named Jason Riley, who had been struggling to find steady work since leaving the Army. He showed up 15 minutes early every day, asked good questions, and had the rarest quality I know how to look for. He could stand still and watch someone work without getting bored. 3 months later, I hired another, then another. Slowly, almost without noticing it, I stopped rebuilding furniture and started rebuilding lives, including my own. People occasionally asked about my family. I would smile and say they were living their own lives, and most people had the grace to let it go. I never spoke badly about Nathan. Not because he deserved protecting, because bitterness is expensive, and I had already lost enough that year. As winter gave way to spring, I locked the shop one evening and stood in the gravel lot looking up at the faded sign above the door. Bennett's Auto Repair. I smiled. Maybe it was time for a new name, not because I wanted anyone to remember mine. Because after everything, I had finally started to believe I had a future worth putting a name on. The first sign that my little workshop had become something larger wasn't the money. It was the waiting list. One Monday morning, Jason walked into my office, carrying a clipboard and a puzzled expression. "Mr. Whitfield, yeah? We're booked 6 months out." I looked up from the workbench where I was restoring a walnut secretary desk. "What?" He handed me the schedule. Every slot filled. Customers from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania. A family from Virginia willing to drive 8 hours because they had heard, somehow, that there was an old man outside Columbus who could make broken things whole again. I leaned back in my chair. "I guess we'd better get to work." Jason grinned. "I've been saying that for weeks." I laughed. And that laugh felt entirely different from the one I had laughed on a sidewalk with a manila envelope in my hand. That laugh had been the sound of a mind refusing reality. This one was the sound of a man being pleasantly ambushed by his own life. We renamed the business that spring. A handcrafted sign, walnut with hand-carved letters, went up over the door, Whitfield Heritage Restoration. Gus stood beside me during the small ribbon cutting, rubbing the edge of the sign with one weathered thumb. "You know," he said, "this place looks better than it ever did when I owned it. You gave me a chance." "No, Gerald." He shook his head. "I gave you a building. You turned it into something people believe in." I never forgot those words. Buildings are made of concrete and steel. Businesses are built on trust, and trust is the only material I have ever worked with that cannot be sanded smooth after it splits. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the gravel lot, and a sharply dressed woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Jason whispered, "She looks expensive. Let's hope she can afford us." She introduced herself as Diane Foster, an interior designer from Cleveland. One of her clients owned a historic mansion built in the late 1800s, and nearly every original piece of furniture side needed restoration. "How many pieces?" She opened the portfolio. 37. I nearly dropped my coffee. It was the largest project anyone had ever offered us. "I'll have to think about it." Diane looked genuinely surprised. Most people would accept immediately. Most people don't know what they're promising. I spent 2 days studying every photograph before I said yes. The project took almost 9 months. Every table, every chair, every cabinet, every carved headboard. Some pieces required hundreds of hours, and a kind of patience that cannot be hired, only cultivated. When we finished, the homeowner invited us out to see everything return to its rooms. He walked through the house in complete silence, room after room, then turned toward me with wet eyes. My grandfather would have cried. "So did your furniture," I said. He laughed. "What do you mean?" "Every piece in this house was asking somebody not to give up on it." He stood there for a long moment. Then he shook my hand. "I'll never hire anyone else. Neither would his friends." Within a year, luxury hotels, historical societies, and 2 regional museums were calling us. We never advertised. Satisfied customers simply talked, and in my experience, word of mouth travels farther than any billboard ever built. The local television station asked to film a short feature. I almost declined. I have never liked cameras. Jason talked me into it. "It's good for the business." The reporter spent an entire day inside the workshop. Instead of asking about techniques, she asked about philosophy. What makes restoration different from replacement? I picked up an old dining chair with a cracked frame and turned it toward her. Replacement is faster. Restoration is respectful. What do you mean? This chair has survived birthdays, Christmas dinners, arguments nobody ever apologized for, homework, grandchildren standing on it to reach a cabinet. I set it down. Wood remembers, so do people. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. By Tuesday morning, the phones would not stop ringing. Orders doubled again. Success brought a problem I had never anticipated. I could not keep doing everything myself. At 74, my hands were still steady, but there are only so many hours in a day, and the day has never once negotiated. Jason came into my office carrying a stack of applications. "We need more people, I know, but not just workers." "What do you mean?" "We need craftsmen." That was a different search entirely. Anyone can be taught to sand wood. Not everyone can understand why an 80-year-old widow weeps when you hand back her husband's rocking chair, looking exactly the way she remembered it. Skill mattered. Heart mattered more, and heart cannot be trained into a person who arrived without it. So we started an apprenticeship program. Young men, young women, military veterans, single parents, laid-off construction workers, and one high school art teacher who had decided at 46 that she wanted to build things that lasted. I taught every one of them the same lesson on their first morning. We're not in the furniture business. Someone always asked the same question. Then what business are we in? We're in the memory business. A few years later, a producer from a streaming documentary series contacted us. They were filming ordinary Americans preserving traditional craftsmanship, and they wanted one episode on furniture restoration. I nearly refused again. Jason laughed at me. You're getting predictable. I don't like attention. You like helping people. That's different. The documentary will help more people find us. He was right, as he had irritatingly begun to be about most things. The crew followed us for almost 2 weeks. They interviewed customers whose heirlooms we had restored. One woman brought out her father's military footlocker, the one we had rebuilt from a hinge and a prayer. I thought it was beyond saving, she said, and then she looked at me. You gave me another 20 years with my dad. I didn't know what to say. You never really do, in moments like that. The documentary premiered 6 months later. I watched it alone in the office after closing the shop, the way a man watches something he is not sure he wants to see. Near the end, the interviewer asked one final question. Have you ever experienced losing something you loved? I hesitated on camera. The silence went on long enough that I remember thinking they would surely cut it. They didn't. 14 years ago, I finally said. I looked down at my hands. Someone left me with $100 and told me I'd figure it out. The interviewer stayed quiet. So did you? I smiled. I figured out something they never expected. What was that? No one can sell your future. They can sell your house. They can take your belongings. They can drive away and never look back. But they cannot decide who you become after they leave. That line became the most quoted moment of the entire series. People began writing letters, actual letters on paper, in envelopes with stamps. Veterans, widows, divorced fathers, retired teachers, cancer survivors. Some thanked me for restoring furniture. Most thanked me for something I hadn't realized I was offering. Money came faster than I had ever imagined. For the first time in my life, I had more than enough. I could have bought a large house, a luxury car, a place on a lake somewhere with a dock nobody used. Instead, I kept driving the same old pickup. I still packed my own lunch. I still swept the workshop floor every evening before locking up. Jason teased me constantly. You know you're the richest guy in the building. I also own the broom. So I use it. One afternoon I received a letter from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. They were looking for businesses willing to mentor young adults, aging out of foster care. I read that letter 3 times. Then I set it down and looked around the workshop, and I remembered sleeping in a truck, under a buzzing parking lot light, wondering whether it would matter to anyone at all if I simply stopped existing. Nobody should begin adulthood feeling abandoned. I called Jason into my office. We're starting something new, he sat down. What kind of project? Not a project, a promise. Within a year, Whitfield Heritage Restoration had launched a scholarship and apprenticeship program that paid young adults a real wage while teaching them a skilled trade. Watching those kids gain confidence reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. The greatest thing you can build isn't furniture. It's people. I never imagined that one quiet interview about an old workshop outside Columbus would travel far beyond Ohio. But it did. And 700 miles away, someone who shared my last name was about to hear my voice for the very first time. By then I had almost forgotten what it felt like to wonder whether my phone would ring. Not because nobody called. Quite the opposite. Customers called, suppliers called, museum directors called. Apprentices called on Saturdays, when they had glued something backward, and were hoping I would find it funny, which I generally did. Life had become wonderfully ordinary. The particular kind of ordinary I had once believed was stolen from me forever. Every morning followed nearly the same rhythm. Coffee at 6, unlock the shop at 7. Walk through every station before anyone else arrived. Check the moisture readings in the lumber rack, sharpen what needed sharpening, sweep the floor. I liked being first. Wood has its own silence before a building fills with voices. It reminded me that every day begins unfinished. So does every person. One Tuesday morning, Jason came in carrying a tablet. You made the news again, I sighed. Did someone finally complain that I'm too stubborn? He laughed. No. He tapped the screen. The governor visited that workforce training center yesterday. They mentioned your apprenticeship program by name. I looked at the article. There it was, a photograph of 6 apprentices standing beside me in the shop. Most of them had grown up in foster care. 2 had been homeless within the previous 3 years. 1 had recently become the first person in his family to buy a home. The article wasn't really about me. It was about second chances, which was exactly the way I wanted it. Jason smiled. You've built something bigger than furniture. I've built people who don't need me anymore. That's the goal. It always was. 700 miles away, in a quiet neighborhood outside Raleigh, North Carolina, my grandson Caleb was sitting at his family's kitchen table with a laptop open in front of him. I didn't know any of this until much later. Afterward, he told me the entire story, slowly, over several visits, the way you tell something you have gone over in your head too many times. It began with homework. His American history teacher had assigned every student in the class the same project. Research someone in your family who made a difference in their community. Most students chose grandparents, veterans, teachers, firefighters, small business owners. Caleb was 17, and he wasn't especially close to any of his grandparents. His mother's parents lived in Florida and sent a card at Christmas. As for me, he remembered almost nothing at all. He was 4 years old when they drove away. What he had were fragments, the kind that survived from that age. A deep laugh. A wooden toy train with wheels that actually turned. The sensation of being lifted onto somebody's shoulders and finding the ceiling much closer than expected. When he asked Nathan about me over dinner, he told me the room went strange and quiet. What about Grandpa Gerald? Nathan barely looked up from his plate. We lost touch years ago. Why? It's complicated. Renee changed the subject with the efficiency of long practice. You could do the project on your great-grandfather instead. He was in the Navy. But teenagers are naturally curious, and nothing sharpens that curiosity like adults, who refuse to answer a simple question. Later that night, Caleb opened his laptop and typed 2 words, Gerald Whitfield. Then he hit enter. The first result surprised him. Whitfield Heritage Restoration, preserving America's family history. The second surprised him more. A magazine profile, from homeless senior to master craftsman, the improbable second life of Gerald Whitfield. Then another, and another. A television interview, a documentary episode. Photographs of an old man in a canvas apron standing beside apprentices half a century younger. Articles about a scholarship program. A regional business award. A speech given at a vocational education conference in Cleveland. Caleb later admitted something that broke my heart in a way I had not expected to be broken at that point in my life. I thought there had to be 2 Gerald Whitfields. He could not reconcile it. The grandfather nobody in his house would talk about, and the man strangers wrote articles about. He clicked the documentary, the same one I had almost refused to film. He watched quietly for nearly an hour, alone in a dark kitchen with the volume low so his parents wouldn't hear. Near the end came the interview. Have you ever experienced losing something you loved? The long pause, the old man looking down at his own hands. 14 years ago, someone left me with $100 and told me I'd figure it out. So did you? I figured out something they never expected. No one can sell your future. The documentary never mentioned a single name. It never accused anyone. It never showed a photograph of my family. It was not about revenge. It was about resilience, and I had made that clear to the producers before I ever agreed to sit down. But Caleb knew. He recognized the age. He recognized the timeline. He recognized the $100. And he recognized one sentence he had heard his father say years earlier, at some point in his childhood, in a tone he had been too young to interpret. He'll figure it out. He froze. Then he replayed the interview, and replayed it again, until the sky outside the kitchen window began to go gray. When Nathan came downstairs the next morning, Caleb was already sitting at the table. The laptop was still open. My face filled the screen, paused mid-sentence. Nathan stopped walking. According to my grandson, every bit of color left his father's face at once. Dad? Nathan didn't answer. Is that Grandpa? Silence, Dad. Renee walked into the kitchen carrying a coffee mug. The instant she saw the screen, she stopped too, and the mug never made it to the counter. Nobody spoke. Finally, Caleb said, very quietly, "The documentary says somebody left him with $100. He looked up at his father. Was that you? Nathan lowered himself into a chair very slowly, as though his knees had abruptly stopped agreeing to the arrangement. Caleb had never seen his father cry. Not when relatives died. Not during the year the business went under and they nearly lost the house. Not once in 17 years. That morning he did. He covered his face with both hands. "I'm so sorry." Those were apparently the first words out of his mouth, and they weren't spoken to anyone in the room. Renee started crying too. For several minutes no one said anything at all. The documentary kept playing quietly in the background, and my voice filled that kitchen in North Carolina. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it simply keeps pain from becoming your future. Nathan stared at the screen. I never thought. Renee finished it for him, that he'd make it. Nathan nodded without looking up. I thought. His voice broke apart. I thought he'd end up in a nursing home somewhere. I thought within a year he'd be somebody the state took care of. Instead, I had built a nationally respected company, a foundation, an apprenticeship program, and an entire life. Without them. 700 miles away and 14 years deep. That afternoon, Nathan found the business website. The contact page listed one office number. He called. Jason answered. Whitfield Heritage Restoration. A hesitation on the line. Is Gerald Whitfield available? May I ask who's calling? A long silence. Then barely audible. I'm his son. Jason told me later that even through a phone line he could hear the shape of a man's regret. He transferred the call to my office. I looked at the unfamiliar North Carolina number on the display. Something inside me knew before I had any right to know. I let it ring. Voicemail answered. 5 minutes later he called again. Then Renee called from a different number. Then another number I didn't recognize. Then another. By that evening, I had 23 missed calls. The next morning there were 68. By noon, 94. Voicemails began filling the inbox faster than I could have listened to them if I had wanted to. Please call us. We need to talk. We're sorry. Caleb wants to meet you. I know I don't deserve this. I listened to none of them. Not because I hated my son. I have never once hated my son. And I want to be very clear about that, because I know how this part sounds. I didn't listen because 14 years earlier, standing on a sidewalk in front of my own house, he had not wanted to hear a single word from me either. By the end of the second day, my phone displayed a number I never imagined I would see attached to my own family. 217 missed calls. Jason looked over from the workbench. You planning to answer any of those? I slid the phone back into my pocket. No. You angry? I thought about it carefully, because he deserved a real answer and so did I. No. Then why not? I looked around the workshop, at the apprentices laughing over a jointer, at a dining table waiting under a drop cloth. At 14 years of a life I had built one repaired hinge at a time. Then I smiled. Because after all this time, I finally get to choose when the conversation begins. I didn't return a single call for 8 days. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted my son to suffer. Though I'll admit there was a moment or two in there when the thought arrived and I had to escort it out. I simply wasn't ready to reopen a chapter that had taken 14 years to close properly. Every voicemail sounded almost exactly the same. Please call, I'm sorry, we need to talk. Then one message sounded different. It wasn't Nathan. It wasn't Renee. Hi, Grandpa. The voice was young and unsteady. He hesitated for several full seconds, long enough that I thought the message had ended. I don't even know if I should call you that. Another pause. I'm not calling because of money. I don't want anything. A breath. I'd really like to meet you. If you don't want to, I understand. I completely understand. But if you ever change your mind, and here his voice cracked clean through, the way a 17-year-old's does when he has been holding something for days. I'd like to know the man everybody else seems to admire. The message ended. I listened to it 3 more times. Jason came into the office with a stack of invoices. You okay? Instead of answering, I handed him the phone. He listened all the way through. When it ended, he set it down carefully on my desk and looked at me. That's not your son. No, that's a kid looking for his grandfather. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window at the workshop floor, where 3 young apprentices were laughing over something while sanding a dining table. For 14 years, I had taught every single person who walked through that door one lesson above all others. Don't punish someone for damage they didn't cause. Children do not inherit broken furniture. Neither do they inherit guilt. I finally said, I'm going to meet my grandson. We agreed on a Saturday morning, not a restaurant, not an office, the workshop. If Caleb wanted to know who I was, he ought to see the place that had rebuilt me. I arrived earlier than necessary. Old habit. Coffee in one hand, shop keys in the other. I unlocked the front door, and the smell of walnut and cherry and fresh sawdust met me the way it always did, like a dog that never learns to be casual about your return. By 10 o'clock, the apprentices had gone for the weekend. The building was quiet, exactly the way I wanted it. At 10:15, a silver SUV pulled into the lot. Only one person got out. A tall, thin young man with nervous eyes and his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He looked around the property for a moment before he spotted me standing in the open doorway. For a second, we simply looked at each other across 40 feet of gravel. Then he smiled. It was Nathan's smile, exactly Nathan's smile, only kinder and unpracticed and entirely his own. "You must be Caleb." He nodded. "Hi." He laughed awkwardly at himself. "I've practiced saying this all week, so have I." He walked toward me. I wasn't sure if I should hug you. I wasn't sure either, so we shook hands. And then, almost at the same instant, we both started laughing, and whatever had been standing between us stepped aside. "Come inside." For the next 2 hours I showed him everything. The woodworking shop, the finishing room with its ventilation hoods, the restoration studio where the delicate work happened under bright lamps, the 2 training classrooms with their scarred practice benches. He asked good questions. He asked what the moisture meter was for, and why we kept the humidity where we kept it, and how you can tell walnut from stained cherry across a room. We stopped beside an antique oak table waiting its turn under a work light. "What happened to this one?" "House fire." He ran a hand near the blackened edge without quite touching it. "Can it be saved?" "It'll always carry the scar. So you cover it?" "No." I set my hand flat on the wood. "We make the scar part of the story." He was quiet a moment. "I think that's kind of beautiful." I looked at him. "That's true for people too." Around lunchtime we sat in the small break room eating sandwiches. Jason had insisted on dropping off that morning, under the transparent excuse of checking on a delivery. Neither of us talked much. Sometimes silence isn't awkward. Sometimes it's the most honest thing available. Finally, Caleb looked down into his paper cup. "I'm sorry." I frowned. "For what?" "My family. You didn't sell my house, I know. You didn't leave me $100 in an envelope." "No, you didn't tell me I'd figure it out." He shook his head. "But they're my parents." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "Listen to me carefully." He looked up. "Children don't inherit guilt." His eyes filled. "I've felt awful ever since I watched that documentary." "I know. I keep thinking, if I'd known about you earlier, you were 4 years old, I could have looked you up. 2 years ago. 3. You didn't know there was anything to look for. I should have asked more questions." I smiled at him. "And now you are." For the first time since he had arrived, his shoulders came all the way down. That afternoon, another vehicle turned into the parking lot. I hadn't invited anyone else. Somehow I wasn't surprised. Nathan got out first. Renee followed several feet behind him, the way a person walks when they are not entirely sure they have been permitted to come. They both looked older than I had allowed myself to imagine. Nathan's hair had gone almost entirely gray. His shoulders had a permanent slope to them. Life, I understood immediately, had been considerably less generous to him than he had expected it to be. He walked toward the shop slowly, not confidently, like a man approaching his own sentencing and hoping the walk lasts. Jason glanced through the office window. "You want me to ask them to leave?" "No. You sure?" "I've waited 14 years. I set down my coffee." "I can wait another 5 minutes." Jason nodded and quietly disappeared into the back office, and I have thought many times since about the particular decency of a man who knows exactly when to become invisible. Nathan stopped several feet away from me. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked around the workshop, at the racks of lumber, at the wall of hand planes, each one sharpened and oiled and hanging in its place. "I've seen pictures." His voice barely rose above a whisper. He swallowed hard. "I didn't understand." "No," I said. "You didn't." He looked at the apprentice workstations, at the framed newspaper articles, at the awards hanging in a modest row along one wall, and the photographs beneath them. Scholarship graduates in cheap suits, veterans grinning beside restored furniture, young men and women who had arrived at 18 with nothing and left with a trade. This. He looked around again as though the room kept expanding. "You built all this, with a lot of help." He covered his face with one hand. "I thought." He stopped, tried again. "I honestly thought, after we left," his voice cracked. "I thought you'd end up in a nursing home. I know. I never imagined, I know." Renee stepped forward. Tears were running freely down her face, and she made no effort to manage them. We told ourselves it was temporary. Neither Nathan nor I said anything. She continued anyway, and I understood that she had been carrying this speech for a very long time, and needed to set it down somewhere. "We kept saying we'd check on you once we got settled. Once Caleb started school. Once the money situation stabilized. Then months passed. Then a year. And every single year it got harder to admit what we'd done. Because the longer you don't call somebody, The more calling them means confessing. Nathan stared at the concrete floor. I was ashamed, I answered quietly. You should have been. He nodded immediately, without hesitation, without defense. I was, for 14 years. Then he looked directly into my eyes for the first time. I've replayed that day thousands of times. So have I. I don't expect forgiveness, I know. I don't deserve another chance, I know. He took a deep, shaking breath. I just needed you to hear something. I waited. I'm sorry. It was not the quick kind of apology people offer to end an uncomfortable conversation. This one came out, slowly, painfully, each word fighting its way past something. I was greedy. I was selfish. I convinced myself that selling your house was practical, and I let a lawyer tell me the paperwork allowed it, so I wouldn't have to ask myself whether it was right. I told myself you'd be fine because I needed you to be fine. He looked around the workshop one last time. The truth is, I chose convenience over my father, and then I spent 14 years pretending that was a decision instead of a betrayal. Silence settled over the room. Even the building seemed to hold its breath. Outside, a light rain had started tapping at the high windows. Then Caleb quietly stood and walked over beside his father. He put one hand on Nathan's shoulder, not to defend him, simply to keep him standing, and for the first time in 14 years, I did not see the man who had abandoned me on a sidewalk. I saw a broken son finally telling the truth. Whether that truth would be enough, I still did not know. But it was at last a place where healing could begin. Nobody moved. For what felt like a full minute, 3 generations of one family stood surrounded by furniture that had survived fires, floods, neglect, and time. I could not help noticing the irony. For 14 years, people had brought me broken things, because they believed those things could still be saved. Now my own family was standing in front of me, broken, waiting to find out whether I believed the same about them. Nathan cleared his throat. I've rehearsed this conversation for weeks. I wanted to explain everything. I shook my head gently. You don't owe me an explanation. His shoulders fell. I owe you one, maybe. I looked him in the eye. But explanations and excuses often wear the same clothes. He nodded slowly. I know, I've had 14 years to think about it. So have I. For the first time since he had arrived, neither of us was trying to win. We were simply telling the truth, and it is astonishing how much easier a conversation becomes when both people give that up. Nathan pulled a folded envelope from his jacket. I brought something. He handed it to me. Inside was a cashier's check. The amount made me blink twice. It represented nearly every dollar he had received from selling my house, along with 14 years of accumulated interest. I sold our house for this, he said. Our house in Raleigh. Renee's car. I've been putting it together since the morning Caleb showed me that screen. He looked away. I know it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't. I don't expect you to cash it. I brought it because it was never mine. I folded the check and held it back out to him. No, he looked confused. Dad, I don't want it. You earned it. No, I smiled sadly. I earned it before you ever sold the house. He lowered his hand. Then what do I do with it? That's your decision to make. That's the whole point. He stared at the check as though it had suddenly gotten heavier. I've carried the weight of that money for 14 years. I believed giving it back was the only thing left I could do. And you don't want it. I looked around the workshop. Every beam, every workbench, every apprentice's name written in marker on a plastic bin of chisels, every restored heirloom waiting under a drop cloth for someone to come and be reunited with their own history. I already turned $100 into everything you see here. I smiled gently. I don't need the rest. Use it to build something, preferably something you can't sell. Caleb quietly wiped his eyes. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I hope not. A few weeks later, Nathan called again. This time I answered, not because everything had been repaired, because healing requires conversations, and usually a great many more of them than anyone wants. We talked for nearly 3 hours. About his mistakes, about my loneliness, about Eleanor's death, which we had never once discussed properly, either of us in 12 years of having every opportunity. About the fear he had felt watching his father become less mobile after surgery. Eventually he admitted something that seemed to surprise him, as much as it surprised me. I wasn't trying to get rid of you. I stayed quiet. I was terrified of watching you get old, of what it would ask of me, of finding out I wasn't the kind of man who could do it. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. When Mom died, he said, I convinced myself I could solve every problem in this family if I just moved fast enough. You couldn't? No, And then your surgery happened, and the paperwork was in front of me, and I panicked. You made a terrible decision. I made dozens. He laughed bitterly. I just kept telling myself I'd fix it later. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. Later is one of the most dangerous words in the English language. It is. Later became 14 years. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I asked the question that had lived inside me since that afternoon on the sidewalk. Why the note? He took a long breath. I wish I had a good answer. You don't? No, I wrote it because, his voice broke, I wanted to believe you'd be okay. I closed my eyes. You weren't trying to encourage me. No, you were trying to comfort yourself. A long silence came down the line. Finally, very quietly, yes, forgiveness did not happen all at once. It wasn't a single conversation. It wasn't a dramatic embrace in a parking lot. It certainly wasn't forgetting. Forgiveness arrived the way rust leaves iron under patient hands, quietly, one ordinary moment at a time. Nathan started calling every Sunday. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. He asked about the shop. I asked about his work. Neither of us pretended the 14 years hadn't happened, and that turned out to be the only reason it worked. Renee wrote me a letter, a real one, on paper, in an envelope. She apologized without defending herself, without blaming stress, without blaming youth, without blaming Nathan, without offering me a single reason to feel sorry for her. I wrote back 3 sentences. Thank you for telling the truth. I forgive you. Now live differently. That was enough. It has remained enough. Caleb became a regular visitor. Every few months he drove up from North Carolina, at first with his father, then eventually alone in a hand-me-down sedan with a check engine light nobody could explain. He wanted to learn woodworking. The first time he picked up a hand plane, he looked genuinely nervous. I've never done this before. I smiled. Neither had I once. He laughed. Over the next 2 years he learned to cut a dovetail that would hold. He learned to match grain across a repair, so the eye slides past it. He learned to finish walnut without smothering the character out of it, which is harder than it sounds, and which most people never bother to learn at all. More importantly, he learned patience. You cannot rush a glue-up. You cannot rush a finish, and you cannot rush a family. One Saturday afternoon, while he was sanding an old maple dresser, he asked without looking up, "Grandpa, will I ever work here?" I set my tools down. Do you want the honest answer? Always. You'll never work here because you're my grandson. His face fell slightly. You'll work here if you earn it. His smile came back. I'd rather earn it. I know you would. That's why I said it. And he did earn it. When he graduated from college, he didn't ask for an office or a title. He started exactly where every apprentice starts, sweeping floors, sorting lumber, learning which questions are worth asking twice. Nobody in that building ever received special treatment, especially family, especially him. On my birthday one year, our entire team gathered inside the workshop. Employees, former apprentices, their families, veterans we had hired, scholarship recipients who had driven in from 3 states. The building overflowed with noise and folding chairs and too much cake. Jason walked to the front holding a small wooden box. I've got something. He opened it carefully. Inside lay an old $100 bill, creased in 3 places, the very one. I stared at it. I thought you'd spent that years ago, Jason said. I smiled. I never could. Instead of spending it, I had quietly framed it behind glass years earlier and hung it in a back hallway where almost nobody went. Jason had borrowed the display for the occasion. Below the frame was a small brass plaque. It read, "Someone once believed this was enough to end a man's future. They were wrong." The room erupted. I looked across the crowd. Nathan was standing beside Caleb near the back wall. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything the situation requires. Several months later, I signed the final legal documents, creating the Whitfield Heritage Foundation. The business would eventually become employee-owned. No child would automatically inherit it. No grandchild would automatically control it. The people who built it together would own it together, and the ones who came after would have to be worth it. Nathan was in the room when I signed. I had asked him to be there, and I had explained exactly what it meant, and he had listened all the way through without a flicker of complaint. Afterward, he said one thing: "That's the right way to do it." It was the first time in his adult life I had watched my son want less for himself than he was entitled to want, and I understood in that moment that the money had never been the thing I lost. The scholarship program expanded across 4 states. Every year, young adults aging out of foster care received training, housing assistance, and a paid apprenticeship that leads to an actual trade. People often ask why I focus so much on them. My answer has never changed. Because no young person should ever have to wonder whether they've been left behind. That mission has mattered more to me than profit ever could. And I have made my peace with the fact that most people will assume that's a nice thing to say, rather than a true one. I am an old man now, older than I ever seriously expected to become, and I have had a great deal of time to think about what actually happened to me on that sidewalk. I want to say some things plainly, because I have met too many people over the years who needed to hear them, and had nobody to say them. The first is this: losing my house was not the deepest wound. I want to be honest about that, because for a long time I told myself it was, and telling yourself a smaller truth is a very effective way to avoid a larger one. The house was wood and brick and a roof that needed replacing anyway. What I actually lost that afternoon was the belief that my own son wanted me. That is a different kind of loss entirely. A house can be replaced by a building. There is nothing that replaces being wanted, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never gone without it. The second thing is about paperwork, and I ask you to take this part seriously, even though it is the least emotional thing I will say. I signed a power of attorney on a hospital tray table 40 minutes before a surgery, with a pen that wasn't mine, without reading past the first page. I did that because I was frightened and tired, and because the man handing it to me was my son. I want you to hear how ordinary that is. Nobody in that room was doing anything unusual. That is precisely how it happens. If you take one practical thing from my life, take this. A power of attorney can be written narrowly. It can exclude the sale of real property. It can require a second signature. It can name someone outside the family as a co-agent. It can be made to expire. You are allowed to ask a lawyer to explain every single paragraph before you sign it. And you are allowed to take as long as you need, and if anyone in your family becomes impatient while you do that, you have just learned something important about who should be holding it. Financial exploitation of older adults very rarely arrives as a stranger with a scheme. It arrives as somebody you love, holding a folder, saying it's easier this way. Being careful is not an insult to the people who love you. The ones who genuinely love you will not experience it as one. The third thing is about what it means to be treated as though you are finished. There is a moment that comes for many of us, usually somewhere past 65, when the world quietly reclassifies you. You feel it in how people speak to you at the pharmacy counter. You feel it when a doctor addresses your adult child instead of you. You feel it when someone decides on your behalf that your remaining years are a logistics problem, to be managed rather than a life still being lived. I want to say this to anyone who has felt that reclassification happen. They are describing themselves, not you. When somebody looks at you and sees only a burden, what they have revealed is the limit of their own imagination. And their imagination is not a fact about your future. It is a fact about them. I was 68 years old with a rebuilt knee, $100, and a truck. I was by any reasonable accounting finished. I want you to notice that the difference between finished and beginning turned out to be nothing more dramatic than a broken rocking chair, and a woman who was willing to pay $20 for it. Purpose is not something you find. It is something you accept when it comes to the door carrying something broken. The fourth thing is about forgiveness, and I want to be careful here, because forgiveness is the most misused word in the English language, and I refuse to add to the damage. Forgiving my son did not mean pretending it hadn't happened. It did not mean telling him it was all right, because it was not all right, and it never became all right. It did not mean cashing his check and declaring us even, and it certainly did not mean I owed it to him, on any schedule, at any point, for any reason. Forgiveness meant that I stopped paying interest on a debt I hadn't incurred. For a long stretch of those 14 years, I carried the resentment carefully. The way you carry something you believe is protecting you. It wasn't protecting me, it was billing me. Every hour I spent rehearsing an argument with a man 700 miles away was an hour I did not spend in my own life, and he was not being charged for a single one of them. So I want to say clearly to anyone waiting for an apology that may never arrive: you are permitted to put it down before it comes. Putting it down is not the same as saying it was acceptable. You are not the guard of that debt. You never volunteered for the job, and if the apology does eventually arrive, as mine did, 14 years late, and considerably more sincere than I expected, you are allowed to take your time with it. You are allowed to say yes slowly. Reconciliation is not owed simply because remorse has finally been produced. Trust is rebuilt the way anything is rebuilt, which is to say gradually, in the presence of evidence. The fifth thing is about my grandson, and it is the one I care about most. Caleb was 4 years old when his parents drove away from my house. He did nothing. He knew nothing. He spent 13 years in a home where my name was a closed door, and then he opened it himself because a teacher assigned homework and a boy was curious. If I had punished him for what his father did, I would have completed the very thing that was done to me. I would have taken a child and decided in advance that he was disposable, based on circumstances he had no vote in. Children do not inherit guilt. Please hear that if you hear nothing else. Whatever your family did, whatever your parents did, whatever was done in the house you grew up in, you are not the sentence being served. You are permitted to be someone entirely different, and the people worth knowing will help you do it. And the last thing, rebuilding a business was not my greatest victory. Rebuilding a family was, and I want to describe honestly what that actually looked like, because the movies get it wrong. We did not become the family we used to be. That family was gone. It went into a moving truck on a Tuesday afternoon and it did not come back, and I stopped grieving that specific loss somewhere around year 9. What grew in its place was something else, something humbler, something honest. A family built on truth instead of appearances, which is smaller and plainer than what we had before, and considerably stronger, in the way a repaired joint is often stronger than the original wood. That is the whole trade, and I would make it again. So if you are listening today and someone has made you feel disposable, because of your age, your circumstances, your health, your past, the mistakes you have made, or the ones that were made to you, I want you to take one thing from an old man in a workshop in Ohio. Do not let their opinion become your identity. People can take your possessions, they can take your home. They can walk away and mean it. They can look you in the eye and hand you $100 mats and tell you that you'll figure it out. But they cannot decide the value of your life. Only you decide what gets built from whatever is still in your hands. And sometimes the smallest beginning turns out to be the strongest foundation. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have ever had to rebuild your life after a betrayal you never saw coming. Somebody scrolling past tonight may need to read exactly what you have lived through. And if you want more stories about resilience, family, forgiveness, and quiet justice, please subscribe to my channel and stay with us for the next one. This story was written and told by a human being, not generated by artificial intelligence. It draws on the kinds of experiences that ordinary families carry quietly for decades. Names, places, and details have been changed to protect the privacy of everyone involved, and certain elements have been shaped for storytelling. The perspective, the opinions, and the lessons drawn from it are my own, offered in good faith, and they are not legal or financial advice. If you are facing a situation involving a power of attorney, guardianship, or elder financial abuse, please speak with a qualified attorney in your state. Thank you for listening, and take care of the people who took care of you.